Hi, so I'm going to discuss where I'm up to with the GMT Jabber project of short improvisations that I've been doing and will be doing through until the end of March. Um, and sort of discuss where it's come from, where it's going, how I feel about it, and I'll try to keep this relatively brief. I'll try not to go on too many diversions. I do have some notes like I did when I did my review of the entirety of my August project. So let's get into it. I mean, the idea really came about because I've done various durational projects over the last decade and more. Back in 2011, I did a, I think it was 2011, I did a project called Tamlin 11, which was digging into folk song Tamlin, into folk song more generally, as well as into more contemporary concerns. I guess there were elements like folk horror and things in there to extent, various social things going on. That was mixed media. That was something that I was doing online similarly to this. A year or two later, I did a project called 28, where again I was doing visual stuff, photographs, sculptural objects, where I was doing textual things. I think there may have been sound element to that. That was 28 days, sort of the entirety of February. So I've kind of purposely given myself these challenges because it is interesting to push yourself, see if you can keep something going for that length of time. Uh, and it's particularly interesting when something is extending out over a long period of time because I find with any piece of work of any duration, uh, even if it's an improvisation over sort of 5 or 10 minutes, that there will come a point quite often about two-thirds of the way in where it feels like the whole thing is a wreck, where it feels like it's falling apart, like it's absolute meaningless nonsense, and you don't quite know if you're going to be able to rescue it in any way. Um, and that's an interesting challenge, and it's very much akin to the kind of thoughts that are going on in your head through improvisation, where you're constantly uh, sort of keeping track of where you're at. You're listening to what's going on. You're trying to plan. You're trying to uh, guide yourself in certain directions, guide yourself away from other things. Um, but as I say, there were no sort of other durational projects really then for a long time until this past August when I did the 31 short improvs for August 2022. Uh, and that was kind of challenging. Those were 2 minute improvisations. So still short, but longer than the ones that I'm doing at present. Uh, and I was also doing them in the evening and with more of a setup. So it was actually much more of an interference in my life. So although I very much enjoyed the process and wanted to do something similarly durational again, I wasn't entirely sure what that would be, and I didn't want it to uh, kind of impact on my evenings in quite the same way. So for the short improvs, after short improvs, thinking that I would want to do something again, I had some very vague ideas kicking around. I'd previously considered doing the improvs that I did in August. Previously considered maybe I could do them in October through October. Maybe I could do them in December, leading up to Christmas and New Year. Maybe I could do them in January, leading out of New Year. Uh, so that was one thing that was kind of in my head as a possibility. Uh, Something else that was sort of percolating around. I may have mentioned I'd had an idea of doing a sound a day. These would have been very short videos. It would have just been like a single sound, which could be sort of a second up to about 15 seconds, just sort of one day, perhaps. There would have been problems doing that. I'm fairly confident in my voice. I think there's an amount of flexibility there. I don't know that I have a lot of sounds banked that would be sufficiently uh, different from each other to sustain, uh, even as much as a month. Um, and I think partly that was inspired by a very vague awareness of the uh, sort of David Lynch weather forecasts that he does, which I haven't really haven't really watched. Um, but it's something durational that I wanted to do, and I felt kind of for myself as much as anything, because I'm not a big fan of winter. I'm not a big fan of short days and darkness and cold. I like summer, especially now because I do walks of huge distances. And when you have more hours to do that, you can do a lot more with that time. You can get a lot further. There's more you can do with your day. Um, so there were sort of lots of things playing around in my head, um, but that movement into spring was there, and then sort of really spontaneous. I mean, this was really just basically an impetuous decision at bottom. I just thought, okay, we've got GMT coming up, Greenwich Mean Time. That's the time in the UK we have that runs for winter. I mean, it starts in late autumn, goes into early spring. So, as I say, from 30th of October this year through to 25th of March, and that would be 147 days, 21 weeks in total. So less than half the year. I think it's around about 5 months. Um, so that was the target, um, and I thought that was sufficiently challenging. Quite often, when I start durational projects, I don't necessarily not necessarily certain that I can finish them, but I'm usually sort of 80% or more confident that I can. With this one, I was less so because it is a significant chunk of time and it's doing something daily, even if it's only a minute. Now, the advantage of doing uh, things that are short, that are just a minute, doing them in the morning, they can be much more spontaneous, much more improvisational. Um, in terms of setup, I don't need as much. I can just set up my phone. First, I was holding it in my hand. I'm now using a tripod, but I can wake up, set things up, and deliver the improvisation before I've properly woken up. So the whole thing uh, can be out of the way before I've even started my day. So that's an advantage. Um, And it's interesting to see what happens when I haven't had as much time to consider where I'm going to go with an improvisation, because there's always some element of maybe I want to do these sounds, maybe I want to do this kind of an improvisation this time, maybe I want to be more serious, maybe I want to be super quick with this one, maybe I want lots of silences. Um, and there's not as much consideration with these. Um, so that's where we are, where we started. And again, I'm still not absolutely certain that I will be able to do every day for the entire duration of this. I've done 49 days so far. That's pretty good. There are some days coming up, sort of over Christmas and New Year, where I'm a little doubtful. Not so much because of myself, but because of sort of practical limitations. But we'll see. And if I get through that period, then I'm very confident that I can get through to the end of March with no issues. So let's move on to how I think things are going with the project. I think so far it's all going pretty well, and it's been much easier than I thought. Moving it into the morning, making the improvisations a little shorter, and doing them via YouTube shorts. So I'm not having to set up a stream. I'm not having to do all the preparatory work that I was previously. It makes it much more, as I said, spontaneous. Um, so it's a lot more convenient. Now, obviously, there are going to be some fairly poor improvisations along the way. I don't think there's been too many. I'm not the best person to judge, and other than usually listening to them before, once before posting them, I haven't listened back to any of them. So the whole lot might be trash. I don't think they are, but it's not for me to judge. Um, and one thing that I have felt is that I'm able to push myself a little bit further with these. I can be a bit more experimental somehow than I feel I can be with the longer improvisations. Um, simply because I don't know. There's with a shorter format, there feels like there's perversely a bit more flexibility that I'm able to uh, take a single idea and run with that. Whereas with a much longer improvisation, I might want to iterate on it a bit more, develop it, contrast it against other ideas, um, play around with things, or juxtapose it with something very different. Whereas within the space of a minute, although it can be a very long time, you don't have as much um, as much time to do those iterations and experiments. So you can just explore one single idea. Um, like I say, I don't know that I've done as much of that as I'd like, and I certainly haven't gotten as weird as I'd like. But that's pretty much a kind of perennial thing with all my improvisations, that I always feel there's more I could be doing. I could be making them more alienating, more strange, more unpleasant, more embarrassing for people, more uncomfortable. Um, that's kind of a confidence thing. It's kind of also probably linked a bit to uh, sort of internalized cultural things, and certainly elements of autistic masking, where for many years it was a case of don't stand out, don't draw attention to yourself. Uh, whereas I find that I care kind of a lot less these days. Um, one of the things that has become obvious is that there are certain very predictable ways that my improvisations play out. Uh, and that kind of applies also to the longer ones, but I'm thinking here specifically, really, of the short pieces. So uh, there's a few spectrums where things tend to crop up kind of a lot at one or the other end of that spectrum. So one of the noticeable things is uh, the variation between things that are fairly minimal, where it might be a single idea or just a small number of ideas, and that idea will be iterated a large number of times, or it might just be a few times at protracted length. And at the other extreme, there's the more maximal things where there's a lot of sounds happening. There might not be any breaks. Things just keep going. Perhaps it's fairly loud as well, and just throwing in idea after idea, zigzagging, constantly trying to trip myself up. Another spectrum is kind of related to that. It's sort of sound at one end and silence at the other. So sound not leaving a lot of breaks, just constantly having this churn of things that are happening all throughout. And at the other end of the spectrum, making much more use of active silences. I haven't done as much of that as I like, because again, it's a relatively short period of time, but it would be interesting to continue exploring that and do that much more, uh, because I think I emphasized this in my last one of these kind of reflective streams. I really like active silences where it is as much a component of the piece as the different sounds are, where it's a structural, it's an a kind of auditory element. Um, and another one that's sort of much more, I guess, subjective, much more uh, perhaps in how I perceive things, is um, silly versus serious. And I, I'm well aware that my silly might not be um, seen as silly by other people, and might even, be seen as perhaps sinister, as might also some of the serious stuff. But certainly in my own head, I'm aware of some things being just daft and ridiculous, maybe cringy and embarrassing, uh, because that's kind of the point of them. Other times, I find myself being more serious. Generally, in a longer piece, I like to have sort of both interplaying. I like when these things uh, play around with each other. But again, we're dealing with a very short set of improvisations. Now, I'm sure there are other spectrums that I'm operating on, but one of the things that's come up a couple of times, which I think I'd like to dig into a little more, is uh, that brevity and the way that I find myself approaching it. I've mentioned previously that when I'm improvising, and I'm sure it's the same for other improvisers, that there is a lot going on in your head all the time. There's constant monitoring of what's happening. There's a sort of retrospective um, kind of analysis of what's happened, then maybe trying to remember elements that you want to bring back or refer to or develop, and there's planning ahead, thinking about where this is going, how this is going to end. But of course, within a minute, that's much more accelerated, particularly the idea of how it's going to end, because you just don't have the time to do that. And I'm I'm finding certainly that a lot of these things are a lot of these improvisations are just kind of ending. I'm just kind of continuing on. I've hit a point where I don't want to develop much more, but I don't really want to stop. And I think it works for the format because if you're watching the short, it'll just keep rolling. And usually that can be quite seamless if you're not kind of watching it for the jump in the video when it restarts. Quite often, sound wise, it's pretty seamless. Not that I'm necessarily going back to exactly what I was doing at the start, but just because my voice sounds the way it does, so things fit fairly well together. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of activity going on in my brain, not necessarily always massively productive. So I've now run out of my notes, but I think there's still a little more to go. Certainly in terms of where do I think this is going, and I don't know. Really, it's very difficult to get a view on this, particularly as I haven't listened back to all 49 minutes of the entire thing so far, which I will at some point just to sort of see if there is any kind of um, thread, any kind of commonality, any uh, sort of narrative line that's emerging. I don't think there will be. I'm aware that there have been some things that have just clear, sort of very serious, straightforward improvisations. There are other things that are just me goofing off. There are things that are combining the two, but there's not much in the way of uh, development. I'm not particularly referring back to other things. I'm not trying to develop any ideas. So I think it's going to continue on in pretty much the same way, which I don't know is going to make for a coherent body of work, other than it will be consistent with the way that I improvise. It will be consistent, obviously, with the sound of my voice and the sorts of sounds that I can make. It will be consistent in that these are all minute long improvisations. But yeah, um, I don't know. I will keep going with it and hopefully keep trying to push myself a little further, trying to experiment a bit more. Uh, it's it's an interesting process. I hadn't considered that doing these reviews sort of one third of the way through, two thirds of the way through, would cause this problem because it's an incomplete project. It is still happening. Um, this does seem, however, to be integrating better with my regular, longer weekly improvisations. In that I'm not having to switch from one mode to the other as much. I think it helps that these improvisations are in the morning, so that by the time it comes to the evening on a Friday, I've already mentally prepared myself. And speaking of mental preparation, something that I forgot to get into uh, about durational projects and about this one in particular. One of the reasons I'm finding this fairly easy to deal with is that uh, having done a lot of walking uh, throughout my life, but in particular over the last 7 or 8 years, and starting to do much longer walks. So, not just sort of walks 6 to 10 hours, but much more regularly walks of 8 to 10, 11, 12 hours. And then in the summer, occasionally things are 14, 15, 16 hours. And over the last couple of years, walks that have been 17 hours, one that was 20 hours. These gearing up and being very familiar with these long walks, I've got a much better sense of how to pace myself, how to cope with something that it's seemingly endless. You get yourself into a rhythm with it. You find the right pace, and at the moment, it does. I am only a third of the way in. It feels like I'm sort of very much starting. I'm very much coasting along. I'm still very much playing around, experimenting, seeing what happens if I go in this direction, what happens if I go in that direction. Um, there is still lots of things that I want to do, even if maybe these things sound a little bit samey. So that's kind of where we're at present. Seems to be going well. Um, I'm because because these are shorts. These are getting a lot more views than my longer pieces normally do, and that's attracting the occasional um, person who wants to play and complain that things are embarrassing, which is always fun. Um, I like that, especially since I am currently blocked from Twitter. It's good to poke a few people who think that it'll be funny to poke the bear, and who think that I'm not aware of how these improvisations sound. I'm very well aware of how these improvisations sound and how they look, especially if you don't have the context of other things like this. Um, it's fun. It's fun to do them, um, and I will continue. I, I don't know if I will ever do another project quite like this again. I doubt it. I will probably do more durational projects. I will probably do more durational sound projects, certainly. But I don't think I will ever do anything quite as punishingly long as this one. Um, and but who knows? Who knows? Uh, Sorry, this hasn't been quite as fluent as the retrospective that I did for my August thing. Like I say, I ill prepared, hadn't taken notes sufficiently early, hadn't really spent enough time today preparing my notes. But I think I've got out kind of all the significant thoughts that I had. So yeah, in summary, uh, I enjoy durational projects. I've done durational projects before. This one suggested itself to me. There was a built-in framework that I could use. I've picked a better time to do these in the morning when I'm half awake, when it doesn't need as much setup, when it doesn't interfere with the rest of my day. I'm noticing, as you would, patterns in the way these things structure themselves. I can't see where they're going. It's still very early. Probably when I come to do the review of two thirds, which will be on the 4th of February, um, maybe at that point I will be despairing because traditionally that's kind of around the stage between there and three quarters of the way in where everything just looks like a complete wreck and you cannot see how anything worthwhile is going to come out of this. Um, but it, I don't know that it's feeding into my broader improvisation practice very much. That's something I didn't consider. and it's not something I've thought about much, but it's not something that's impressed itself on my brain either. I haven't noticed too much of a spillover, although I have noticed that not every day, but on some days, I'm finding it easier to have a clarity of purpose for the minute. Um, but yeah, I was summarizing. I think I'd finished my summary. Yeah, there are patterns that I've noticed. That was the sort of other part of the summary. Patterns I've noticed in terms of minimalism versus maximalism, sound versus silence, silliness versus seriousness. Uh, and I'm sure there are other sort of combinations of ideas, but generally, yeah, I think it's going well. It's seems to be pleasing the small number of people that I sort of hope to please. It seems to be annoying exactly the kind of people that I hope it will annoy, and it feels good. I'm enjoying it. It's easy. Maybe it shouldn't be easy. Um, and I'm as confident as I can be that I can get it past Christmas. And once it is past Christmas and New Year, then I'm very confident that, bar me getting run over by a bus, I can get it through to the end. So yeah, I will be back with my next improvisation in the morning. I will another sort of summary of where I'm up to in February, 4th of February. I think it is. And until then, yeah, hope you have a good rest of your day. And yeah, I will see you soon. Cheers. Bye.